Everyone, today we're going to work through IXL assignment WCZ, add and subtract positive and negative decimals. So let's quickly remind ourselves on how we add and subtract decimals. The nice thing is the process is the same whether you're adding or subtracting. When you're working with decimals, it's really important that you line up that decimal point. So that way all of the place values are in order. And then one thing that can be really helpful is in this example here, when you have one number that goes all the way to the 1000th place, and then a number that's only to the 10th place, is by adding some zeros as fillers. So that way you can still make sure that all your numbers are lined up and perform that addition or subtraction. Once you do that, you just add or subtract like normal and make sure that you bring the decimal point straight down. When you're working on the IXL assignment, you will have both positive and negative decimals. So let's quickly refresh our memory on those adding and subtracting integer rules, because we are going to apply those rules to our decimals. Remember that when their numbers have the same sign, you just add the numbers and keep the sign the same, because you're either continuing down the positive side of the number line or the negative side of the number line. So if we look at our examples here, if you have -3 plus -5, it would be -8. Same sign, add and keep the sign. Where it takes a little bit more focus is if the signs are different. If your signs have different values, even though there's a plus sign there, you're technically going to subtract, because that negative is saying that you're taking it away. So take away, subtraction. We have 3 plus -5, we would subtract, giving us 2. But then to determine whether your answer would be positive or negative is you look at the number that is heavier. So there are more 5s than there are 3s, and because your 5 is negative, your 2 would be negative. But in this example down here, when it's -3 plus 5, again, their signs are different, so you would subtract, still giving us that 2, but this time it would be a positive, because the 5 is heavier, the 5 is positive, that equals that positive 2. Whenever you get a subtraction problem, to make things easier, I encourage you to rewrite it as adding the opposite. So in this problem here, -3 minus a -5, you see that subtraction sign? Let's rewrite it to add the opposite. So adding the opposite of a -5 would just be adding a +5. 3 plus 5, and then you can follow your addition rules. So by changing all your subtraction problems to be adding the opposite, because subtracting is adding the opposite, it's the same thing, then you can just follow those two rules, and once you get that practice, it becomes significantly easier. All right, let's put these concepts together, hop on over to IXL and practice adding and subtracting positive and negative decimal numbers. All right, here we are on IXL, assignment WCZ, add and subtract positive and negative decimals. And don't forget that IXL also has a super helpful video that you can watch, so you're more than welcome to view that if you want extra practice or just want to hear it from a different point of view, because sometimes that can help make things click. All right, when we have our first problem here, the first thing I'm going to worry about is my signs, because that's going to tell me whether I'm really adding or really subtracting. Because I know the problem says add, and there is a plus sign there, but remember our adding integer rules. We need to determine whether the signs are same or different. In this case, our signs are different. We have a positive number and a negative number. So when your signs are different, that single negative is saying, oh, you do the opposite. We're taking that away, which means we really would subtract. And then is your answer going to be positive or negative? So we've determined that we need to subtract. Let's go ahead and determine the sign of our answer. Well, the 8 6/10 is heavier. It is a larger absolute value than the 1 4/10. So because of that, that means the sign of the 8 6/10 is going to be the sign of our answer, meaning our answer will be negative. So now that you've determined that you're subtracting and your answer will be negative, you can honestly just ignore the signs and just do that subtraction as normal. Just make sure you've either made note of it or you go back and double check that in the end so you don't forget your sign and get the answer wrong. All right, so because we're subtracting, we need to put our larger number first. So we have 8 6/10 minus 1 4/10. And we've lined up our decimals. We don't need to fill in any blanks with zeros because they have matching place values. 6 minus 4 is 2. Bring down your decimal point. 8 minus 1 is 7. And as we had said earlier, our answer is negative. So it would be negative 7 2/10. And if we enter that in, make sure you have the proper sign. It will show us that we're correct and we'll get a new one. All right, next up, negative 9 1/10 plus negative 8 7/10. All right, let's start off with our signs first. I notice that both my numbers have the same sign. They're both negative. So when the signs are the same, you add and keep the sign the same. So I'm going to be adding these numbers, and if we keep our sign the same, that means our answer is going to be negative. When you add, it technically doesn't matter if the larger number is on top or bottom. I usually still just place it up top just because I'm a creature of habit and that's what you do with subtraction, but it technically doesn't matter the order when you're adding. All right, my decimals are lined up. So 7 plus 1 is 8. Bring down the decimal. 8 plus 9 would be 17. And of course, don't forget that it is a negative. We would have negative 17 8/10. All right, now we have a problem that's initially telling us to subtract. But remember, when you're dealing with positives and negatives, if you have a subtraction sign, you want to rewrite it as adding the opposite. Some of you may know that as keep, change, change. I'm going to take my initial problem here and rewrite it as adding the opposite. So I keep the first number the same, change my subtraction to addition, and then the second number becomes the opposite. So the opposite of a negative 7.8, or sorry, a negative 8 7/10 would be a positive. Now that we've done that and it's rewritten as an addition problem, we can check out our adding and our adding rules. The signs are different, a negative and a positive. So when the signs are different, we technically subtract and we keep the sign of the heavier number. 9 1/10 is heavier. There's more of those. So that means our answer will be negative. Now that we've established that, we can go forward and subtract per usual. All right, when we get to a scenario like this where we have 1 minus 7, when it's written in this format, we can't do that. Remember, we have to regroup, we have to borrow. So we can go next door, borrow from our 9, making it an 8, and our 1 becomes an 11. So 11 minus 7 would be 4. Bring down that decimal point. 8 minus 8 is 0. And of course, don't forget your negative. Always make sure that when you're finished with your problem, you double check, you triple check your sign so you can get the proper credit for it in IXL, because there's nothing worse than doing it right on paper, but typing it wrong and it messing up your SMART score. All right, let's do just a couple more problems together. So if we have one like this, negative 5 5/10 minus 8 5/10. I see a subtraction sign. So the first thing I need to do is rewrite it to add the opposite. So we keep the first number the same, change your subtraction to addition, and change it to add the opposite. So the opposite of a positive 8 5/10 would be a negative 8 5/10. Now what do? Are we really adding or are we technically subtracting? We're really adding, because when the numbers have the same sign, you add and keep the sign. So we're going to add these numbers together and keep our answer negative. So 8 5/10 plus 5 5/10. We've lined up our decimal. 5 plus 5 is 0. Remember, when that happens, we carry our 1. And now we have 8 plus 1, which is 9, plus 5, which is 14. And don't forget that it would be a negative. We technically could enter our answer like this, but remember when we have trailing zeros, that would be equivalent. That would also be equal to just 14. All right, this will be the last problem we do together. So we're being asked to add -3 75/100 plus 1 75/100. First thing, are we really going to add or are we actually going to subtract? We're going to subtract because remember when your signs are different, which is what we have here, a negative and a positive, you subtract and keep the sign of the heavier number. In this case, our heavier number is the -3 75/100, meaning that our answer will be negative. We can perform our subtraction here. Make sure to line up your decimals. 5 minus 5 is 0. 7 minus 7 is 0. Bring down your decimal point. 3 minus 1 is 2. And don't forget that it has to be negative. Now, if we were talking about money, we would definitely want to keep those zeros there to represent $2. But because we're not talking about money, we could go ahead and simplify our answer as just a -2. All right, it's now your turn to hop on IXL. Make sure to go to WCZ. Check out IXL's help video if you'd like to see more examples, but I think you guys can do it. Bye.